We have three wonderful panelists who are about to join me, and I hope they will leap up to stage because we want to use every second we have. But as you see, we have a list of simple questions to answer. Can we completely increase and feed everyone not using an iota more land or water to feed the planet? So given these very simple questions to answer, we're going to try to go down our really lovely panel with about 2 to 3 minutes of recommendations, discussions of your own experience and what you've been working on. And by way of this briefest of introductions, I wanted to say that Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, the founder and president of Ocean Collectiv, who's also at New York University, her mother is a farmer in upstate New York with 300 laying hens, so she gets to go up on weekends and have direct experience of this. Izabella Koziell, Director of Water Land Ecosystems of the International Water Management Institute, is based in Sri Lanka now and doesn't have much opportunity to do a lot of farming, though she visits many farms, has lived in Kenya and Tanzania and various parts of Africa, India for 5 years. So she's gone to the most rural, the poorest farms, thought about land production, how it can be increased. And then last we have Ruth Kimmelshue, Corporate Senior Vice President of Business Operations and Supply Chain and Sustainability at Cargill, who has the distinction of being a fifth-generation farmer from north of Chico, California, which, as you all know, is north of Sacramento, for almonds and things. And that gives me a chance to say I'm a fifth-generation farmer from potato family in rural northern Connecticut. So we have farming in common, we have interest in sustainability in common. And can we start with Ayana?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a marine biologist by training. I spent the last 15 years trying to figure out the puzzle of how to sustainably manage fishing and coral reef ecosystems, looking at that both from the ecological perspective as well as thinking about the social and cultural context, behavioral economics, and of course policy. I think what the three of us share is a strong interest in how policy can be a part of the solution here. And it's a really complicated puzzle. And it's certainly parallel to farming as well. So when I think about how we can increase the production of food without expanding too much our impact on the environment, one of the things that I think of is along the lines of what our last speaker was talking about the importance of small-scale fisheries that actually provide the majority of the seafood that we eat, while at the same time having a much smaller impact on climate because of reduced fossil fuel use. They're fishing closer to shore and actually employing many more people and having a greater support for food security. So one of the questions I think is how can aquaculture also support that? I think one of the opportunities is thinking about integrated aquaculture or 3D ocean farming. How can shellfish and algae become a big part of how we feed people because they don't require a lot of inputs from the land? And the last thing I'll say by way of opening remarks is that it's important to think about this land-sea connection. They're not separate, and so algae and seaweed, kelp can be really important fertilizers. Obviously, the way we do farming on land and the runoff from that impacts the sea. So I'd love for us to think about those connections as well as the broader cultural context for what we eat and what we should be expecting to eat. Can we 8 billion people be eating salmon sustainably at all is certainly a question.
You were saying that algae can feed some surprising food crops and proteins. And what are some of the uses you'd like to see algae put to?
I think most broadly, the science and research on how algae is a really powerful fertilizer, and sea minerals more generally are a really powerful fertilizer, is a science that has been lost. There was a lot of research done on this in the 70s, and that kind of fell by the wayside. And when fertilizer is fossil fuel based,
as most of it is,
yeah, it's important to think about what are the alternatives for that.
Great. I can just see the wheels turning in our other panelists. So we'll next go to Izabella.
Hi. Thanks very much for inviting me today. It's really exciting to be here to talk about an issue that I've worked on for most of my career, working right across Africa and Asia. And it's really exciting to see that finally we're bringing together the science, the policy, and the business communities. So at the moment, I run a research for development program. It's a publicly funded program, and we work to find solutions to the more sustainable management of water, land, and ecosystems, but working and focused on the food and agriculture sector. And our clients are some of the poorest and most vulnerable farmers in the world. So I hope that we remember the plight of these farmers as we move through the next 2 days. Obviously, the issues we tackle are very challenging. But I think, as Christina said this morning, there's a lot of complexity, but that doesn't mean to say that there are solutions out there. And that's what I'd just like to reflect on briefly now. So we do have solutions. There are a lot of solutions. We've been discussing them just earlier today. But from my experience, I see that really the policies and the economic incentives are not quite right. In our program, we have multiple solutions to delivery of more productive water, to delivery of biodiversity-friendly farming, but this is not scaling up. And that is because our policies are not right, our institutional mechanisms are not quite right, but we're working on them, and we do have solutions. We do have some new ideas of how to move forward. The other area that I think is kind of complicated is the fact that some of these solutions do have unanticipated consequences, and we do have to keep an eye on those. And a lot of these unanticipated consequences tend to agglomerate and come together at scale. So, for instance, you give a farmer a solar pump, the farmer is likely to pump more. And our program has been looking at how you can create the institutions to incentivize the farmer in the right way, not to over-pump with solar pumps. And finally, I'd just like to say that science policy divide is still there. We're working very hard at it, but can we please look at different models of how we can get science more effectively into policy and how we can get the policymakers talking more effectively to the scientists? We have examples of that. It does take time, it does take patience, it does take the right people coming around the table. But we've got some exciting models of where we have done that, where we're looking at circular economy and how to recycle organic waste into fertilizers in peri-urban areas. So it is possible. Thanks.
Terrific. I will be asking you about some of those exciting sounding specifics, and we'd like to hear now from Ruth.
Great. Thank you. It is really a privilege to be here. I will just call it out because it's obvious. I'm the one representing Big Ag.
And you admit it right off the bat.
I do. Yeah. But I work for Cargill. I have the privilege to lead our global supply chain organization as well as lead sustainability for Cargill. And I'm a big believer that we can do well by doing good. And so it's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to hear from the many, many voices and bring the family together around the table, as we heard earlier today, to really try to wrestle with some of the challenges that we all face as we lean into feeding a growing planet and doing that in a really sustainable way. Cargill's purpose is to be the leader in nourishing the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. And about 2 years ago, we added the safe, responsible, sustainable piece to that purpose because we believe that it's very important that we take the opportunity and the obligation that we have to demonstrate leadership in our global food systems. And it's the very reason why we come to this type of an opportunity to learn and to share. It is a highly complex challenge, as we've all acknowledged. If it were easy, it would have been solved already. But it is
by the end of today, we'll have it licked.
By the end of this panel.
Yeah, that's right.
But we all have the privilege to lean into that and to help create solutions. We need to address issues of large-scale farming as well as smallholder farming. We need to address issues and opportunities of developed country consumption and developing country consumption. Along the way, clearly understanding what are the trade-offs, the costs and benefits associated with the choices that we make. And as we talk about the great opportunities that we have, it's really critical that in our organization we bring some of those solutions to the ground, to people who are actually producing the food that we eat around the world, and to help them to become more productive with the land that they have, to have access to free markets, fair markets through free and fair open trade, to understand what technologies we can apply in a way that allows us to do more with less. Because it's through a combination of all of those kinds of solutions that we're actually going to achieve find the answer to the problem that we face.
Great. Izabella, we were both excited, and Ayana, when we were talking, I mentioned that I run a food policy research program at the Aspen Institute, and your immediate response was, we're policy nerds. So, great. And we talked about the difficulty of enabling much of anything in India on any kind of scale because of the way the country is organized or not particularly organized. So I'm giving you a magic wand right now. I'm handing it over virtually. And you can ask the government of Sri Lanka, of India, of East Africa to enact wide-scale policies that you've designed. Could you give us some of them and how that would result in preservation to the environment?
So I won't be able to give you all the solutions, but I think one key issue to me is if we want to protect smallholder farming systems, where we know that there are multiple other values coming out of those smallholder farming systems, like agricultural biodiversity, then we really can't expect farmers to continue pursuing those types of farming methods without some sort of additional benefit and income to their livelihoods. And currently, a lot of these farming systems don't break even, and that's why we have a lot of men leaving the farms and leaving the women on the farms. So if I had the magic wand, I think we do need to set up some sort of large-scale payment for environmental services mechanism. We have been trialing these for a long time. They haven't worked so well. But I think if we could get the right funding mechanism sorted, then I think that would help. I think technology helps now. So there's so many new mobile payment systems so we could pay farmers to deliver those services. So that's exciting, that's different. Is there a new way we could generate finance for these types of schemes, like crowdsourcing grant finance from the north to support these types of schemes? It's beginning to happen, but it's still not wide scale. Because there is a big question, if we are to set up these schemes, where does the money come from? I think there is also climate finance. Is that another opportunity? Because obviously these landscapes, when they're multiple use and multiple benefit, they are more resilient. So could we use climate finance for that?
as well.
So we never can lose track of economic incentive and the high role it plays. Ayana, did you have any magic wand?
I would love to borrow your magic wand for policy change.
It's in Isabella's possession. So
perfect, I'll take that. I think one of the sort of easiest opportunities for policy change to make fishing more sustainable is simply to eliminate subsidies for industrial fishing. That's one of the targets under the UN Sustainable Development Goal for the ocean. Just stop funding unsustainable fishing. Another policy that I would love to see in place is more protected areas. We have currently only 2% of our ocean protected from fishing, and scientists are recommending at least 30%.
2%?
Yeah, 2% is not enough. So, I mean, and we're much far ahead on protection on land. So that's another thing I would love to see. And we also need to enact policies on land to prevent runoff and things that are hurting the ocean. But a very easy one, easy in theory if you have a wand, is to reduce the amount of single-use plastics. Because a lot of that is ending up in the ocean. Every 4 seconds, a ton of plastic is entering our ocean.
And plastic accounts for 75% of the waste in our oceans, and it's the 10 most commonly used plastic items. Right now, everybody's obsessed with straws, as you know. But yes, plastic.
Bottles are the biggest one, yeah.
Those are great things. So, Ruth, you had mentioned that Cargill has trained at least 650,000 farmers in more sustainable methods, which sounded staggering and fantastic to me. Could you mention what some of the sustainability methods they learn from Cargill are? And is that applicable mostly to larger scale farmers or also to smallholders?
Mm-hmm. So, as you know, Cargill operates lots of global supply chains, and we're working really diligently to ensure that those supply chains are as sustainable as they can possibly be. And a critical part of that starts, obviously, with on-farm production. And so depending on where we are in the world, the solution is different. For example, in the Yucatan Peninsula, we've worked with corn farmers to increase their yields on the same amount of land and reduce their cost of production. So we've helped farmers to increase yields by 45%, reduce their cost of production by 30%. And when you consider the math associated with that, it creates a really dynamic and beneficial equation. In addition, we've worked with cocoa farmers, specifically in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, to use more improved productivity methods that are also more sustainable, and have helped them to increase their production up to 65%.
Is that different inputs? Is it different genetics of the cacao pods, or how?
Yes, and. So it's all of those things together, as well as just known practices. In the Midwest of the United States, we are part of an organization called the Midwest Row Crop Collaborative, working with corn and soy farmers to use more sustainable methods to ensure less runoff of inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, into waterways, because we know that agricultural runoff is contributing to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And so how do we go back to, in some cases, lower tech solutions, age-old solutions like cover crops, and ensuring that we use the right level of fertilizer application so the plant can actually take up the nutrients and the additional doesn't run off? How do we build those capabilities and the understanding and awareness of those capabilities, working with other stakeholders in the supply chain to give those practices to farmers so that they can increase productivity, which means more economic stability, but do that in a way that actually protects the environment. And so the sustainability of their production for the long term so that they can become 5th generation, 6th generation farmers.
As you are lucky enough to be in a family with a 6th generation on the way. You happily jumped to my next question, which was technology, its potential and its limits, something that we briefly discussed, and you had opinions about them. So, Ayana, would you like to start sharing where you think technology could help with your wand and where it pushes up against limits?
I think what Ruth said is really poignant, and so I'll start by repeating that, which is I think there's a lot we can learn from the past, and that looking to new innovations is not necessarily where we should be focusing all of our time. I think previous generations have solved a lot of these problems because of the constraints that are put on them by environmental conditions already, whether that's drought or inability to move far from shore, or the need to, the need to meet local food needs. So I would say let's start by looking at history before we spend too much time innovating, because we'll be reinventing the wheel likely in a way that's not the most efficient. But I think there's a great role for technology when we think about two things. One is data. How are we making sure we're learning as much as we can and sharing information about how to do wild fishing and aquaculture most effectively? And the other is enforcement. I think because of the size of the ocean, it's certainly inefficient to be patrolling everything with boats. And so there's a role for technology in thinking about how we monitor and enforce wild fisheries. And so we're starting to see more use of drones and satellites, aerostat balloons and hydrophones in this networked system for understanding what's happening in the ocean so that we can actually get a handle on how to properly manage and control that. So technology for enforcement and technology for data, but not necessarily technology for more intensified fishing, because what we've seen is that use of technologies that were actually developed for war, whether that's sonar and radar and these large ships.
Or fertilizer from explosives.
Yeah, has all sort of not gone well. So I would say less of that kind of technology for massive exploitation and more of the technology for better understanding what the more nuanced options are and preventing the piracy that we're seeing. Because in 2018, we still actually have a lot of pirate fishing happening around the world.
We didn't discuss this, so you can just deflect it and say, sorry, you didn't prep me for this. But whenever I read about the improvements made to aquaculture and how, what a great thing it is, and the enormous percentage, something like 80% of the, or more of the fish we consumed is aquaculture. When I read, on the one hand, the wonderful things about how efficient it is, that'll be followed by a report in a few weeks about the horrible runoff and dead zones and drop-off of the unused fish feed. So do you have...
It really depends on the type of aquaculture. So I think we need to sort of disabuse ourselves of the notion that farming fish will feed the world if we continue to want to eat salmon and tuna and shrimp. I mean, those are the most popular seafoods in many places, and farming them is often unsustainable because of the inputs required. Of course, there's been a lot of innovation in feeds, and that's heading us in the right direction. But if we want to be truly sustainable, there's an opportunity to think about eating lower on the food chain. So thinking more about shellfish and algae as the bulk of what we're farming, and then fish as a smaller portion of that.
We share passion for... I was about to ask you about salmon feed and fish feed.
Yep. So Cargill is one of the largest producers of salmon feed in the world. And we are employing technology, including things like producing microbes that consume methane that then can be harvested to replace the marine protein in salmon feed. So we're not harvesting fish to feed fish. We're actually producing other types of high-quality protein with high omega-3s to then, in turn, feed fish, which is obviously a sustainability benefit. And I think, the critical piece is that protein is a critical part of a healthy diet. And there's a whole spectrum of protein that we can consume, all of which are good in moderation and hold their own space. Marine protein is one of the most efficient proteins in the world. And so how do we balance consumption of marine protein appropriately with consumption of pea protein, for example, or other vegetable proteins?
I was about to ask Izabella to speak up for legumes, but...
Yep, exactly. And how do we balance the consumption of beef, which is obviously the least efficient form of protein, but can be produced increasingly in a more sustainable way, with increasing vegetables in our diet. And so it's a both and,
as you were mentioning, if you feed those cows algae, certain types of algae, you can reduce their methane emissions by 90%.
Yeah, there's some really interesting. So as it relates to technology, it's the balance, right? And bringing in some of those new technologies that actually give us more effective methods to feed the planet in a more sustainable way.
Great. Izabella, I know that you mentioned the use and the utility of technology in your field as far as microfinance, credit, making these mechanisms more easily available. Are there other ways that you see technology as helping or destructive in a way that upsets you?
So I'll probably start with the less contentious aspect of technology. So I think there are many good things happening now: remote sensing, analysis of the data through big data methodologies. There's so much more we can do, whether it's for monitoring and enforcement, or our programs now been analyzing soil data, so that we can look at how you more efficiently apply fertilizer.
And in the areas you've been working, are those used on any scale?
Yes, they're beginning to be used. So our program has set up this whole new database of soils for Africa. There's a new technology that's being trialed, which is called spectroscopy, where you do dry analysis of soils. It's low cost. You can take it out to the field. So a farmer can get a much better analysis of his or her soil. And then it's a win-win, really, because less spent on fertilizers and so on.
That's the less contentious part.
That's the less contentious. Another less contentious, of course, is solar irrigation.
Sure.
Big growing area. I mentioned it at first. But let's not forget that there are many good developments out there. Of course, you're wanting me to get to the more contentious, which is
only if you wish.
The GMO debate. It's a very difficult one. It's a very difficult one. It has a difficult history. I feel that it's not an either-or. There are some good aspects to GMO technology, but it is certainly not the silver bullet solution.
So it's one of many.
It cannot be the only solution, and I think we can. This whole debate here is about sustainable and healthy food. It's not just about producing more. It's producing more nutritious food, and of course, we mustn't forget that many traditional varieties were far more nutritious than some of the modern varieties. Except, of course, now we've got new technologies with biofortification and so on.
Gene editing. So we're coming down to the end of time, but I've taken away your wand and I've made you delegates to COP24 in Poland. And you are going to give your recommendations for helping preserve the environment, stop environmental degradation, while, if not increasing the amount of food we produce, at least keeping it level. Do we want to? Do you need a second to think, or do we want to?
I got it.
Okay.
Easy.
Covered. Ayana.
I would say, so we're already fishing to the maximum sustainable yield or overfishing 90% of our fish stocks. So obviously, if we want to feed 8 billion people well, we need to think about how to do fish farming or aquaculture more generally. And I would propose that the aquaculture that we need to think of is sort of multi-species integrated polyculture, if you will, and thinking about vertical ocean farming so that we're not using as much ocean space, but thinking about how can we be growing oysters in cages on the bottom, vertical, kelp and other algae, ropes covered in mussels, and thinking about just the huge amount of healthy food and protein we can get out of a vertical column of water. And I would also mention that we need to think about what our cultural expectations are for eating food and how we might need to think about starting to shift our most commonly consumed foods towards things that are more sustainable on the 8 billion person scale. So less tuna, less salmon, more algae and
more
shellfish.
herring.
And sardines and anchovies, for sure.
So I'll focus on one issue, and that is we need to focus on women. There's a lot of discussion about women, and there's a lot happening to include women in the debate, but there is still a lot that needs to happen. Women at the farm level are faced with a barrage of constraints, and we really need to overcome those.
Terrific. And Ruth, you're at COP.
So I would really intensely focus on the impact of agriculture on climate change and find ways to positively impact carbon emissions in a way that also allows us to still produce the products that we need to feed the hungry world. And it's actually a role that Cargill believes that we can play, demonstrating to the broader ag and food supply chain what it looks like to be more sustainable, to minimize our carbon footprint and carbon impact in a way that still allows us to feed the world.
Well, given the resources, brain power, and passion of this panel, I think we've solved the problem. So we're all relying on you. We're taking you to COP, and we thank you very much for coming this morning.
Thank you.